everyone. Welcome to Pre-Employment Transition Services and Transition Services for Students with Disabilities, the VR Continuum. I'm Brenda Simmons, and here today with me is Bridget Griffin. Bridget, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
So Bridget and I are going to be your presenters for today. We work for the George Washington University as part of the National Technical Assistance Team with the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the Collaborative, or NTAC-C. Our center is co-funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs and the Rehabilitation Services Administration. And we basically provide joint technical assistance and training for state VR agencies, as well as state and local educational agencies, along with our partners, to improve outcomes for students and youth with disabilities. We really would like to welcome you to the second in a series of 3 webinars that offer a really quick overview of the 5 required pre-employment transition services, the VR continuum of services, which we're going to talk about today, and collaboration with education. Each of these webinars are intended to simply introduce participants to the topic and offer a brief snapshot of things to consider when providing or arranging for the provision of pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities. Additional resources and tools and webinars that are related to pre-employment transition services and transition services for students and youth with disabilities can be found on the NTAC-C website, and that is at transitionta.org. So I do need to share this disclaimer, which states that although the content of this presentation was developed by NTAC-C, which is funded by the Department of Education, the contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume any endorsement by the federal government. Okay, now I am going to turn it over to Bridget to get us started.
Thanks, Brenda. Hi again, everybody. If you listen to part 1 of the series, you'll be familiar with the continuum of VR services depicted on this slide. So we'll just do a little recap. Since the addition of the 5 required pre-employment transition services, the VR program can be characterized as providing a continuum of services, with pre-employment transition services being the most beneficial to students with disabilities in the early stages of employment exploration. So pre-ETS and transition services make up the first 2 pieces of this continuum of VR services, with employment-related services focusing on the specific services necessary to obtain, retain, and advance in employment. This continuum is really a roadmap. How interactive and how meaningful this continuum or roadmap will be for the student is really up to the pre-ETS specialist, who provides or arranges for the provision of pre-employment transition services, the VR counselor, and the relationships that they build with the student along the continuum of services. So in this presentation, we're going to introduce VR transition services as part of the VR continuum of services, and focus on how pre-ETS within this continuum, how pre-ETS fits within this continuum of services for students with disabilities. So let's take a brief look at transition services so you can see the distinction between pre-ETS and transition and have a better understanding of how these services can work together for students. Pre-ETS and VR transition services are not mutually exclusive, and they can be delivered at the same time to eligible students and provide an opportunity for a holistic approach to the delivery of services. We will talk more about this in a few minutes. What we do want to point out is that it was never the intent of pre-employment transition services to delay the receipt of any other VR service for students who request or need those services. Pre-ETS was never meant to be a parking lot for students with disabilities. Rather, it was meant to be an early introduction to VR services, an appetizer, as it were, to the full menu of VR services, as we mentioned in part 1. And that full menu includes VR transition services. So what are VR transition services in themselves? So on this slide, it says that Transition services are outcome-oriented services for students or youth with disabilities. So remembering that it's students and youth have access to transition services. Those students or youth have already been determined eligible for VR services. VR transition services are provided in accordance with an approved IPE, and that may be an IPE that has a general goal of competitive integrated employment or a description of the individual's projected post-school employment outcome. VR transition services really are meant to facilitate that movement from the receipt of services from schools to the receipt of services from VR agencies and, if appropriate, other state agencies as well. So I recognize that this slide has a lot of information on it, so we're going to go through it briefly. The bottom line is that any VR service that is provided to an eligible student or youth with a disability can be considered a transition service. The full array of individualized VR services may be provided to an eligible student with a disability or a youth with a disability in need of such services, as long as they are included on an approved IPE. We kind of mentioned that on the previous slide as well. Any allowable VR service can be provided as a VR transition service under the IPE. The individualized VR transition services provided will depend on the student or youth's individual needs and may include, but are not limited to, assessment, counseling and guidance, referral to other services that are needed to secure services from other agencies, transition services for students with disabilities that facilitate the transition from school to post-secondary life, and the achievement of an employment outcome in competitive integrated employment. Job-related services that include job search and placement assistance, job retention services, follow-up services, and those follow-along services that are needed by the student. It can also include supported employment services for those individuals with the most significant disabilities who need those services, and services to the family of an individual with a disability if those services are needed also. So now I'm going to hand it back to Brenda to talk a little bit more about the notice of interpretation.
Thanks, Bridget. So that's really important, right, Bridget? Not to forget that as we have a lot of focus on pre-employment transition services, we can't forget those other VR transition services that are so important for students. So thank you for sharing. I think that was really an important piece. Now we are going to talk to you a little bit more about this notice of interpretation, or the NOI, that some of you all may have heard a little bit about. The U.S. Department of Education issued the notice of interpretation to announce a change in policy regarding the use of federal VR funds reserved for pre-employment transition services. And it was effective the same date that it was issued, February 28th of 2020. Final regulations were issued on March 21st of 2022. The department's policy expressed in this final notice of interpretation is unchanged from what was published in the NOI on February 28th of 2020. Although these new regulations did not expand the scope of pre-employment transition services, they did clarify current policy regarding the permissibility of using funds reserved for pre-employment transition services for auxiliary aids and services, and they announce a change in policy regarding the use of federal vocational rehabilitation funds reserved for the provision of pre-employment transition services. Although these new provisions can be a bit confusing, they provide state VR agencies with the opportunity and flexibility to charge more money toward the reserve funds for the provision of pre-employment transition services. So we really wanted to spend some time to try and help clarify this piece a little bit more. The NOI focuses on two primary areas. First, as I mentioned a second ago, it clarifies current policy that Pre-ETS reserve funds can be used to pay for auxiliary aids and services for any student with a sensory or communicative impairment in order to access or participate in pre-employment transition services. This means if any student with a disability who's included in the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 or the ADA, the definition of auxiliary aids and services requires an auxiliary aid or service to access or participate in any of the 5 required pre-employment transition services. Then VR can pay for those costs if no other public entity is required to provide such aids or services. And auxiliary aids and services under the ADA's Title II implementing regulations includes the acquisition or modification of equipment or devices or other effective methods to make orally delivered information available to individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, or visually delivered materials available to individuals who are blind or have low vision. Some examples of auxiliary aids and services include qualified sign language interpreters, note takers and readers, assistive living devices, video phones, audio recordings, braille materials and displays, screen reader software, magnification software, and large print materials. Auxiliary aids and services do not include personal devices like computers or laptops or tablets. Prescribed devices like eyeglasses, hearing aids, wheelchairs, readers for personal use or study, home or vehicle modifications, attendant care, or other ADL services that might be required. It's important to understand the distinction between an auxiliary aid or service from a personally prescribed device or service, which is outside of the scope of Pre-ETS. This doesn't mean that these services can't be provided. It just means that they are reserved for those individuals who have applied for VR services, been determined eligible, and the services are listed on their IPE as part of their individual rehabilitation plan. These services, even if included on an IPE, would not be able to be charged to the reserve funds because they fall outside of the scope of pre-employment transition services. Okay, that was the first part. Second, the NOI announces a change in policy with respect to additional VR services needed by eligible students with disabilities that may be paid for with federal VR grant funds reserved for the provision of pre-employment transition services, including the circumstances under which those funds may be used to pay for those additional VR services. These services must be provided in accordance with an approved IPE, are only available for eligible students with disabilities, and must be needed by the student in order to benefit from one or more of the 5 required pre-employment transition service activities. Receiving these additional VR services and supports, along with pre-employment transition services, enables eligible students to develop the skills to experience competitive, integrated employment as they leave school and enter the workplace. So these next couple of slides are like a little cheat sheet to everything that I just talked to you about before. And you guys may want to maybe even print these slides off and keep them as a handy reference, because when you start thinking about what services can be provided and charged to the Pre-ETS reserve funds for either eligible or potentially eligible students with disabilities, it can get a little confusing. So for potentially eligible students with disabilities, they can receive the 5 required pre-employment transition services or auxiliary aids and services. And remember, those auxiliary aids and services needed by a student with a sensory or communicative disability in order to access pre-employment transition services. So this is what a potentially eligible student with a disability can get, right? So now let's take a look at, for those students who are eligible in accordance with an approved IPE, they can also receive the 5 required pre-employment transition services, and those are listed here. They can receive auxiliary aids and services that I just mentioned, and they can receive additional VR services in order to benefit from pre-employment transition services. And remember, these additional VR services must fall within the nature, scope, and purpose of pre-employment transition services for an eligible student in accordance with approved IPEs, right? Okay, so that's really, really an important piece. And we're hoping that these couple of slides can be a really good way for you to just kind of skim over that information. And hopefully that will make sense to you, because that was a lot of info there. Examples, we wanted to share just a couple of examples of those additional VR services for you all. These additional VR services that may be needed by an eligible student with a disability in order to benefit from pre-employment transition services may include things like assessment services, maintenance, transportation, personal assistance services, rehab teaching and O&M, orientation and mobility, family services, and coaching services. So remember that these additional VR services must be provided in combination with one or more of the required pre-employment transition services. So, for example, if a student needs transportation to get to a work-based learning experience, those transportation costs can now be charged to the reserve funds as long as the student has been determined eligible for VR services, and as long as these services are provided in accordance with an approved IPE. Examples of VR services that would not count include job placement, job search assistance, and supported employment. Those are all examples of either transition-related or employment-related services, which honestly, by their very nature, are beyond the nature, scope, and purpose of pre-employment transition services. So again, Bridget, that's pretty heavy, but I am now going to turn it back over to Bridget, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the importance of informed choice throughout this continuum and this process.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brenda. It is heavy, but it's critical information, right? So I really want to turn our attention just a little bit to our responsibility for providing informed choice and information about the continuum of VR services, particularly for those potentially eligible students. Of course, we have to provide informed choice for everybody all along the continuum, but we really want those potentially eligible students to be aware of what is available to them. We know that services for potentially eligible students with disabilities are short-term activities designed to help them explore their potential career goals, and they can be provided through individual, group, or virtual experiences. However, a student may have identified their career pathway of interest, or, as Brenda described in the notice of interpretation, they may need more individualized VR services in order to participate in some type of pre-employment transition services. So it'll be important to define the process that helps determine when a potentially eligible student with a disability should be encouraged to apply for VR services. In addition, you will want to have periodic discussions so potentially eligible students understand their options and are provided to make the opportunity to make an informed choice about whether or not to apply for VR all along the way. We know that students may say no at one point, but may say yes at another point. So this is not a one and done conversation. It should be discussed at the beginning of your engagement with the student and regularly throughout that engagement. Make sure you document that in your case file as you provide that information to students and their families. Another really important consideration here is coordination with the local school district. Because if a student with a disability is able to access additional services that they need in order to participate in pre-employment transition services through the school district or through a family member or some other service, then that student may continue to participate in Pre-ETS as a potentially eligible student until they are ready to pursue additional VR services. So this is another point where communication with education is so critical. So you want to be talking to your partners. We'll talk more about that in part 3, but we know that nothing is divorced from one another. We need to have these same conversations threaded throughout our whole conversation about services to students. So let's take a look at now, how could this play out for a student over time? We're going to look at one example of a student's continuum along their journey along that continuum of VR services. So here we have Chris, who is a potentially eligible student with a disability who was referred by the school to VR for pre-employment transition services at age 14. Let's follow Chris's journey along the continuum a little bit. I worked with many students like Chris when I worked as a VR specialist. Chris's preferences and needs have been identified and are on the blue sticky note on the slide. This isn't the whole story about the student, merely a few considerations to keep in mind when we explore interests, strengths, work preferences, etc. And we use the information we gather as he progresses through the various Pre-ETS activities to help us build his plan for after high school. Through some initial interest inventories and discussions the Pre-ETS provider had with Chris, he identified interest in welding, HVAC, and auto mechanics. Through his job exploration counseling, the Pre-ETS provider set up opportunities for Chris to visit work sites, participate in informational interviews, job shadows, and provided labor market information so he could explore the required training, education, and potential career paths for these fields. Through this process, Chris narrowed his interest to auto mechanics. The Pre-ETS provider and the VR counselor participated in IEP meetings, which included CTE, and these supported Chris with discussing his career pathway interests with the whole team. The IEP team identified what supports special education could provide for Chris to participate in CTE classes and other needed classes. VR coordinated with the CTE teacher to develop a paid summer work-based learning experience with opportunities to learn the basics of oil changing, diagnostics, and tire replacement. Accommodations were arranged to include visual representations of the steps for each task to be learned, and an iPhone application that allowed the employer to create checklists for each task. The Pre-ETS provider taught workplace readiness skills, self-advocacy, and financial management skills. So when we think about the VR continuum of services from a bird's eye view for Chris, at age 14, he did the interest inventories and the worksite tours. Age 15, the labor market information and an informational interview. At age 16, he had that job shadow and workplace readiness training, as well as counseling on post-secondary training options. Chris also applied for VR services at this point, and his IPE with a projected post-school employment was developed. At age 17, he had a paid summer work-based learning experience that pulled in those additional VR services because he had applied and was eligible and had an IPE in place that outlined his services, the additional VR services to support his pre-employment transition work-based learning experience were transportation and maintenance, that was work clothes and steel-toed boots, so he could participate in the work-based learning experience. At age 18, his IPE was amended. He graduated high school, enrolled in an associate's program for automotive service technology, and was also employed part-time at an auto repair shop. At age 19, Chris graduated college, and all along the way with his high school graduation, with his college graduation, and all those skills he gained along the way, VR was able to record measurable skill gains as well as credential attainment. And the school district was also able to report outcome data during this time for participation in college and also the job placement that was achieved. So this is just one case scenario, and just wanted you to be able to kind of look at that from a bird's eye view about how the continuum of VR services can really support a student. On this next slide now, we'll introduce Samantha. Samantha was referred to VR by the school to receive pre-employment transition services as a potentially eligible student with a disability, also referred at age 14. As you can see on the slide, a few of Samantha's preferences and needs include wheelchair access, an alternative input device for a computer, coaching supports, low vision aids, and a communication device. This slide also provides information about how services were delivered to Samantha engaging the VR continuum. This is a good case example for group discussion. So we're going to leave that one for you and not walk through the case, but thinking about it critically the same way we talked about Chris would be a good idea to approach this case. And now I'm going to hand it over to Brenda to finish us out.
Thanks, Bridget. So I think those are great examples, and it would be really awesome if you all have an opportunity to talk with your colleagues, with your peers, and see, maybe how you might play out even some different examples for Samantha or other examples you have that you can think of with students in looking at that overall continuum of services. So finally, we just wanted to mention that in addition to thinking about some of those examples, you may want to think about how do your current work practices align with the intent of pre-employment transition services and student access to this continuum of VR services that we talked about in our presentation today. And what do you think you might do a little differently in the future moving forward, working with students along this continuum? So we know that things are not just a one and done, and there's intentional movement, right, Bridget, along the way to try to help students move through this continuum and access as many of the VR services that can benefit them as possible so that they can be successful. So we just wanted to thank you all today for sitting through part 2 of this webinar series. And we look forward to seeing you for part 3. Thanks so much and have a great day.